I'm always privileged when I visit Berlin to stop over at the Cultural Diplomacy Institute to get a share of their recent projects, initiatives, and to as well have my input on our new initiatives. Today, I would like to talk about the Bahrain Independent Commission Inquiry Report. Bahrain, since the 14th of February, has faced what many Arab countries in what's called or phrased as the Arab Spring have faced. There were calls for democracy, calls for a peaceful transition towards democratic reforms. However, there was a mass crackdown on the democratic movement and the pro-democratic movement within Bahrain, and this led to wide condemnations from the international community to the numbers who were killed on the streets in Bahrain, to systematic torture in the jails of Bahrain, to the large number of those who were expelled from their jobs and suspended from their jobs based on a religious and sectarian background. So this led to the formation of the Bahrain Independent Commission Inquiry. And this is an initiative which is called in Bahrain the Bassiouni Commission. It was established by the King of Bahrain, King Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa, on the 29th of June 2011, which happens to be almost 3 months after the crackdown on the democratic movement, which was demanding for transforming Bahrain to become a constitutional monarchy, whereby the king rules Bahrain. However, the country is governed by an elected government and an elected prime minister. Today I read in the news that the prime minister of Latvia has decided to step down after the fall down of the ceiling on a supermarket. Now, in Bahrain, we have the longest lasting prime minister in the world. He's been the prime minister for the last 42 years. The same prime minister for the last 42 years. So the demands were really driven by a belief that Bahrainis need to participate in deciding the future of their country. A lot of drastic events took place in Bahrain, systematic human rights violations, and all of this was a clear retaliation to the public demands to transform Bahrain to become a constitutional monarchy. So the King of Bahrain has appointed the Bahrain Independent Commission Inquiry, and Amnesty International has described the participants or the team players within the commission as an impressive lineup of independent international experts. The commission was chaired by Professor Mohammed Sharif Bassiouni, who has led United Nations investigations into the alleged war crimes in Bosnia and Libya. And there were other members, including Sir Nigel Rodley, who's a former United Nations Special Rapporteur on torture and currently a member of the United Nations Human Rights Committee. The Commission released a 500-page report on the 23rd of November 2011. and it had almost 9,000 testimonies, offered a clear explanation of the events which took place, offered a clear illustration of the nature of human rights violations in Bahrain, documented 46 deaths, many of them were under torture, documented 559 cases of systematic torture, and more than 4,000 cases of employees dismissed either based on their religious background, sectarian background, or based on their political aspiration to see a more democratic Bahrain. The report has also confirmed and inspected 30 religious structures, mosques, that were demolished by the regime. Bahrain, unfortunately, has demolished 5%, almost 5% of the registered Shia mosques within the country. The Commission has found that certain abuses, such as destruction of property, could not have happened without the knowledge of higher echelons within the regime and within the command structure. It's impossible to say that those mosques were demolished without the knowledge of those influential figures on the top. We cannot hold responsible a person who has delivered the task without holding those who have given the instructions to demolish those mosques responsibility for the actual cultural crime of demolishing the mosques. The report also has rejected the government's claims that the protests were instigated by Iran. The Commission found no valuable or substantial evidence of Iranian involvement in the pro-democratic marches in February 2011, but found the marches inspired by the Arab Spring in Tunisia and Egypt. The US Ambassador Thomas Krajewski denied, the US Ambassador in Bahrain, Thomas Krajewski, denied in a senator hearing in September 2011 that Iran was behind the political unrest in Bahrain. So the BCI has also affirmed that the democratic movement in Bahrain is a national and domestic movement that has no links with external or regional entities, including Iran. After the King of Bahrain has announced the formation of the Commission, it's very important to understand that the international community played a very positive role in welcoming the establishment of the committee. The US President Barack Obama praised the establishment of the Commission on the 2nd of July 2011 and said, by providing an independent assessment of what happened and identifying those responsible, the Commission will play an essential role in advancing reconciliation, justice, and peace in Bahrain. This is a clear message which indicates that one of the goals of the Commission should be ending impunity given to torturers and given to those who have massive and systematic human rights violations. The White House deputy spokesman as well welcomed the announcement and has stated that it's a step in the right direction. This is all in 2011. And we're talking right now in the 2000, after 2 years of the commission presenting the report. But we'd like to take an in-depth look into the time frame and the events which took place since the formation of the commission until today, to understand where we stand right now and to highlight what we expect from the international community, what we expect from human rights bodies, what we expect from diplomats. This is a very important message which should be conveyed to the international community. So the White House has stated that it's a step in the right direction and will restore confidence and trust in Bahrain. The United Kingdom Minister for Middle East and North African Affairs, Alistair Burt, has said, "We welcome the establishment today, composed of international figures, to look into the events of recent months and into allegations of human rights. It's a right step forward that will lead to concrete progress regarding the concerns about the human rights situation in Bahrain." The EU High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Catherine Ashton, on the 1st of July 2011, said, "The establishment of an independent commission composed of international members to investigate the origins, causes, and facts behind the many allegations of human rights violations in Bahrain is a right step." Going to NGOs, we need to look at the lovely statements given by Amnesty International about the Commission. Amnesty International labeled the Commission as a significant step forward that must lead to justice for the victims. That must lead to justice for the victims. And this is a clear indication that human rights bodies were looking positively at the Commission's report in order to hold those responsible for human rights violations accountable in front of justice. The leading opposition bodies within Bahrain, including Al-Wifaq, have clearly stated their support for the Commission. In fact, in a lot of the violations, the Commission has relied on resources which were provided by oppositional bodies like Wa'ad and Al-Wifaq. Religious leaders in Bahrain, including Ayatollah Isa Qasim, have personally met Professor Sharif Bassiouni on the 21st of September and have clarified many issues, many fears with regards to the Commission, and have stated in many occasions that whatever the report has stated should be a clear international denouncement of the regime and its human rights violations, and should lead to true transformation and democratic transitions in Bahrain. This is how the international community saw the report 2 years ago. And there were a lot of aspirations, positive feelings about the report and the future after the report. Everyone was looking to pave the way towards reconciliation, establishing peace within Bahrain through utilizing the recommendations of the Bassiouni report. He had 26 recommendations, and those 26 recommendations could have provided the basis of respecting international human rights laws and could have enabled Bahrainis to advance forward towards a meaningful dialogue that will translate the aspirations of Bahrainis looking forward for democracy into concrete action. However, it is very unfortunate today, 2 years after the report, that the government of Bahrain has not implemented those recommendations. And over here, I need to highlight a very strategic milestone, which I believe was in September 2012. And that milestone is the UPR recommendations, which Bahrain has promised in front of the international community to attempt its best to apply all those recommendations as soon as possible. One of those recommendations is implementing the Bassiouni report recommendations, implementing the recommendations of BICI. So it's very much today the role of the international community to exert more and more pressure on Bahrain to put a stop to human rights violations, to put a stop to targeting Bahrainis based on their religious and sectarian background, to put a stop to providing impunity to those responsible for massive human rights violations. It was ironic from day one to a lot of figures who were in charge of implementing the Bassiouni recommendations. Bassiouni has clearly stated in the report that a committee which is granted independence and which represents different factions of the society, whereby civil society organizations are represented, should be in charge of supervising the application and the implementation of the 26 recommendations. However, the government of Bahrain has refused to allow civil society organizations to manage and to observe and to assure all those recommendations given by Bassiouni were implemented on the ground. So a clear question which might be raised in a lot of your minds: how can you delegate the task of putting a stop to human rights violations to a government which has been accused for the last 42 years by international human rights bodies like Human Rights Watch, like Amnesty International, which has been accused by the Human Rights Council at the United Nations of systematic human rights violations? How can you delegate them the task of putting a stop to those violations? It's very clear that this is not possible on the ground. And this is why Professor Sharif Bassiouni himself last year had slammed the actions of the Bahraini government, calling it a whitewash. And over here, I'd like to quote what he said during a TV show at DePaul University. He said, I think the public is going to come out in the end and say, you know what you're holding all of these investigations behind closed doors. This is a whitewash. And I think they would be perfectly justified in saying so. Sir Nigel Rodley, who was the second senior member in the commission, has said just a few days ago, he said, looking back 2 years after the BCI presented its report to His Majesty, I cannot hide my disappointment at the current situation. The dignified response of His Majesty to the report, accepting its recommendations on behalf of the Kingdom of Bahrain, led many to believe that there would be redress for victims of serious human rights violations that have occurred, and there would be a halt to the violations that were still occurring, and that these events would be on a basis, these events could be a basis for reconciliation. The Foreign Affairs Committee within the UK Parliament has also stated the failure of the government of Bahrain to implement the BICI recommendations. Catherine Ashton had a clear statement as well yesterday, claiming that it was the responsibility of Bahrain to truly implement the BICI recommendations. Today, it's clear for the international community that Bahrain, or the Bahraini government, is not serious, does not have the will to actually implement those recommendations. And this is very much linked as well to the continuation of violations related to religious freedom. The Shia community in Bahrain has unfortunately been targeted on and on based on their religious belief. And the Shia community in Bahrain, according to many international bodies, form a social majority, although they are a political minority due to a strategy followed by the regime, but they happen to be a social majority. This majority is denied the right to practice their religious freedom, their religious rituals in complete freedom. And this has been clearly documented. It's been affirmed by international reports, including a report on, including the 2012 report on religious freedom, which was issued by the State Department in the United States, including the report of 2012, which was issued by the US Commission on International Religious Freedom, including tens of reports, which all affirm that Shias in Bahrain are not only victims of discrimination and marginalization and seclusion, they're targeted in their religious freedom rights. And this brings up an issue I'd like to highlight today. While coming over today early in the morning, I've received sad news of the government reaching to the third stage in transforming a historic mosque, which is more than 70 years old, called Abu Dhar Mosque, into a public garden. Transforming a mosque into a public garden. Now, the drive towards such violations are unfortunately driven by sectarian hatred and driven by the growth of extremism within the regime and driven by the influence of the upsurging sectarian tensions in the region, which have driven a lot of officials to regard the Bahraini majorities who are Shias as illoyal citizens or infidels or Safawis or other frames which have been going on and on in the public media. More than 60% of Bahrainis are still victims of sectarian framing strategies followed by the government of Bahrain. Therefore, we believe it's the role of the international community, of our friends in Germany, our friends in Europe, and our friends all over the world, to work towards pressuring Bahrain to end human rights violations and to work towards pressuring Bahrain to reach to a level of religious neutrality when it comes to the grounds of political and civil rights. We believe it's time for our friends, and I was fortunate enough yesterday to meet 2 foreign ministers in my visit to Europe. We believe it's the role of all of us as believers and defenders of human rights and defenders of religious freedom and defenders of respecting cultural diversity to actually pressure the government of Bahrain to reach to a level of cultural neutrality and religious neutrality when it comes to political and civil rights, whereby citizens of Bahrain should be looked at through their national identity rather than being framed by their sectarian, religious identities. And this is a key call we'd like to focus on, and we'd like our friends within the international community to highlight in their meetings. Secondly, the government of Bahrain has pledged to implement more than 146 recommendations laid out by the UPR conducted by the United Nations Human Rights Council. It is necessary for the international community to look at immediate and urgent implementation of those recommendations. And this indicates as well whether Bahrain is serious in stopping human rights violations. We had an experience with the Bassiouni recommendations, and after 2 years, it was clear that Bahrain is not serious in implementing those recommendations. And this brings us to the importance of having permanent monitoring mechanisms, whereby the international community must form committees which would directly document human rights violations, keep a close eye on human rights violations, since it's almost impossible for human rights organizations to work in Bahrain. Human rights figures are targeted, they're jailed, and when you visit any country in the world and you want to have a clear indicator of the level of respect for human rights organizations and defenders, the first question is, where are the human rights defenders? In Bahrain, if you visit Bahrain, you would realize that the majority of human rights defenders are either in jail or in exile or are being targeted frequently by the regime or by the media or Congo's governmental, non-governmental organizations, which are financed and driven by the regime. So it's very important to have permanent monitoring mechanisms on the human rights situation in Bahrain. We would also like to see our European friends in the coming meetings at the Human Rights Council request to open a permanent office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Bahrain to contribute to the correction of the human rights situation in Bahrain. Thirdly, we would like to see our European friends request a time frame to implement the recommendations of the UN Human Rights Council recommendations and the Bassiouni recommendations. We believe the international community today needs to look at joint responsibilities when it comes to human rights across the border, and we would like to see people from different cultures, different religions, different social backgrounds defend the universal human rights of everyone living on this universe, regardless of race, regardless of religion, and regardless of political aspirations or social standings. Thank you for giving me this opportunity, and I'd like to open the arena for questions. Thank you.